All right, so let's get to it. I'm told the purpose of these talks is to introduce each of us to the community at PSI. So I figured I'd start with the obvious question. Who am I? Well, if you're talking about research field, by training, I'm a meteoriticist and an experimentalist. That is, I like to take rocks, grind them up, and stick them in a furnace. Go figure. If you're talking about research fields, well, I'm a geochemist or a petrologist, based on who you talk to and what they choose to care about at that particular moment. I've also become a mineralogist, much to my surprise. Through my work with MSL, I've been dealing with X-ray diffraction, and you kind of have to learn how minerals work to make that work. But my role in that has also made me an instrumentalist. That is, I like taking instruments apart and figuring out where did the errors come in, how do we fix them, and what do we really know based off of what we saw. In general, I'm a Mars scientist because you can't hang out with Marsies for a decade without becoming a Mars scientist yourself. Trust me, I tried. In general, though, about the only unifying theme I could think of was I'm an enthusiast. Pretty much, I love all flavors of research, and I'll get excited about something, so invite me in and see what happens. Now, in terms of what my skills are, and my analytical skills are focused around the electron microprobe. Um, I use that for quantitative analysis and have for quite a long time. I also use laser ablation sourced inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. Now, if that's too much of a mouthful, do what the rest of us do and just call it LAICPMS. In the last few years, I've also been learning about X-ray diffraction and become somewhat of an expert, again, to my surprise. Um, I'm also really good with optical microscopes, which I know aren't exactly cutting-edge technology, but if you need to just look at a rock and figure out what's there and generally what you can say about it before you start using the expensive techniques, I'm your man. Subject area knowledge, I love experimental design. Pretty much, I'm happy to take rocks and figure out what I can do to answer complicated questions with them. Speaking of rocks, meteorites are my jam, particularly differentiated ones, although I'll look at chondrites if I have to. I also deal with chemistry and have a lot of background knowledge in how to take apart a chemical equation and figure out what you're doing with it. Which also, in terms of geology, makes me a petrologist and a bit of a Mars expert. I figured, though, the best way I could really introduce you to who I am was to talk a little bit about something near and dear to my heart. So let's talk about the Shergotite meteorites. Fundamentally, these things are basalts from Mars. We classify them two different ways, texturally and chemically. By texture, all I'm talking about is rock type. So I'm meaning, are these basalts, are these andesites, are these granites? What rock type is it? For you non-petrologists, I'm talking about the black ones. Chemical type, we've got three different reservoirs that we think these things originate of. That is, three different places in the interior of Mars melted. We call them creatively enriched, intermediate, and depleted, because why not? Now, what sorts of questions might you ask if you're looking at different Shergotites? Well, one of them is, where do these magmas come from? And are there relationships between them? On Earth, we know you can take a basalt, turn it into an andesite, and turn it further into a granite. Probably. On Mars, we're not actually sure if you can take one of the rock types we know and turn it into a different one. There's also a question of, where are these reservoirs? We know they're ancient, because we got that from isotope geochemistry, but we don't actually know if they're located in the crust or mantle or both. For that matter, one of the things that seems to be important to this process is volatiles. What I'm talking about is water, carbon dioxide, things of that nature. And this is actually where my PhD research came in. So if I put together a plot where I'm looking at the level of enrichment, which is what's shown on the y-axis here, against the level of oxidation, or oxygen fugacity if you prefer, that's plotted on the x-axis, where the bottom left is depleted and reduced, and the upper right is enriched and oxidized. And I plot up a bunch of the rocks. You can see there's a correlation trend here. And the correlation is that the more enriched it is, the more oxidized it is. Now, this is just one of the rock types, the basaltic Shergotites. If I put up another one, you can actually see the same trend come by, but set off to the side a little bit. Wait, though, it gets more complicated. Because it turns out, if you look at the rocks, the mineralogy that formed very early on versus what formed at the end, phenocrysts versus ground mass, if you like petrology, then you can see there's actually disequilibrium, where the whole system oxidized as it went. Now, because this was only observed in 3 different meteorites before I came along, there's a question of, do these meteorites relate, or do volatiles rather relate only to the enriched reservoir on Mars? Turns out they don't, because I found two depleted meteorites that show this trend. So we know that volatiles are involved in all of the different reservoirs on Mars. Now, I didn't just stop there because I wanted to ask the question of what does that do to the chemistry and the petrology of these rocks? So, ran a bunch of experiments, and what we saw was that the chemical profile of olivine depended upon the history that olivine had gone through. So, if I cool it under reducing conditions, the chromium content, for example, bumps up before it drops down. Remember, reading these plots from right to left because petrologists are backwards. Now, what happens if I oxidize it during the course of events? It turns out, then the chromium content drops monotonically, meaning consistently drops. You never see that bump up. Or still, you look around in nature and you see the same darn thing. So apparently, oxidizing it changes the chemical profile, rewrites history on those olivine grains. Now, this led me to ask the question of, okay, can I see an actual physical result from that, or is it just this chemistry? Turns out you can. On the right here are two pictures of olivine grains that I took X-ray maps of, both of these in chromium. The one on the left that's showing that your screen is not receiving signals snow pattern is completely clear. On the right-hand side, all those little white specks are chromium's spinel grains that exsolved out of the olivine. Exsolved just meaning got kicked out in the solid state. Yay for not melting. Okay, so we can actually see this texture. Is this just in my one meteorite, the Tucson meteorite I was studying, or is this widespread? Well, based on the preliminary data that my co-investigator and I came across, it looks like it's in a bunch of different shergottites. In fact, enough so, we proposed this to SSW. Turns out at 4.5 and no funding later, I'm in the 89% of unfunded people. Ah, well, we'll try again next year. This isn't where I stopped with my studies, though. I like complexity, so why not dive into complicated mess? Elephant Moraine 79001 meteorite is one such complicated mess. Most meteorites have just one rock type throughout. Turns out this guy's got at least two. The top portion of this is a different rock type than the bottom portion of it. We call these lithologies A and B because we're creative that way, but it's even messier still. If you look at all of the olivine grains, which are the big chunks in the lower portion, they actually don't belong in lithology. They're from some other rock and got incorporated while it was still molten. So here we've got a set of at least 3 different rock types, and if you believe my recently published paper, quite a few more. These all came through one volcanic system, so here's a chance to look at all the different rocks that underlie one volcano on Mars. You don't have to guess where these things from different hotspot sources. We know they came out of one system. So here we can start to piece things together. What do I want to do with this? Well, I want to look at the melt inclusions in it to see because those are little snapshots of the liquid as it was cooling. What do we know about volatiles in them? What can we say about how the liquid composition evolved? And can we mix those different textures together? Did we? These are all the sorts of questions that I'm trying to write up for another SSW. But because life's too complicated to just look at the inside of Mars, turns out I also study the surface. I do this by being a scientist on the Mars Science Laboratory mission. I'm not a participating scientist in my own right. I work with David Vanneman, and we deal with the chemin instrument. Turns out there are a lot of instruments on MSL, but if you really talk about the important ones, we're left with just us, the X-ray diffractometer. This is at one of the drill locations as we went along. So what does chemin do? Well, it's an X-ray beam that shoots at a powdered sample. Based on the mineral or the layers within the minerals in that powdered sample, it diffracts at different angles, and you get a pretty ring pattern. Looks something like this. You can take that ring pattern and reduce it to a spiky pattern, which I'm told that remote sensors love for their spectral observations. And if you know what you're doing, you can take those spike patterns to figure out how much of what different minerals that represents and get a composition for what's going on Mars. Well, since I'm a glutton for punishment, I said, can we do a similar thing with the instrumentation on Mars 2020? And I'm trying to convince a whole bunch of scientists that we can. But what's really exciting with that is that we don't just get that information in the bulk powder, which is actually what they've currently proposed. What you can get is that mineral information in a raster pattern. This is our chance to look at the first thin section of Mars, if you combine the data from both the Pixel and the Sherlock instruments. We'll see if my participating scientist proposal gets funded. I hope it does. Any event. So if we talk about all the different things I like to do, Well, I do sample studies and I do laboratory experiments. Pretty much any variation on that, and I'm happy. I'm happiest though when I'm dealing with a complicated chemical system because I like that puzzle solving of pulling all the different pieces together and figuring out how to make sense in the mess and chaos. I also like doing things that are difficult, oddly enough. So if there's quantitative analysis that's hard to take, I'm happy to give it a go. But really, though, anything that relates samples to planetary observations, I'm happy with. And that's true whether it's on Mars or in the asteroid belt, and developing an interest in Venus, and for that matter, Mercury. So, pretty much, if you've got a problem that you think could use a sample scientist, let me know. We'll talk. And that's a wrap.